Hello and welcome. The Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week, our guest is Dr. Nikolaus Overtoom, a professor of ancient history at Washington State University. In this episode, we discuss the significance of Parthian warfare, the strategic use of cavalry, and the logistical challenges of utilizing war elephants, and examining Parthian interactions with the Greco-Roman world to gain a more comprehensive understanding of the ancient Mediterranean world. We hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Thank you for joining me today. I've been looking forward to this exciting conversation, and I would like to start with a really hopefully easy question, and that is, how did you get into the field?
So thank you for having me, Lexi, and I hope that your listeners will be interested in what I have to say here. At the beginning of my path to becoming a Parthian scholar was largely accidental. I went to school for my master's at the University of Maryland, where I studied under Art Eckstein, who had just written a book that focused on concepts of Mediterranean anarchy, looking at why the Romans were successful, but from a broader scope, where of course the Romans were violent and they were very good at violence, but did that make them unique? Actually not. That violence was sort of inherent and rather normalized in the ancient world, and that the Macedonians and the Greeks were just as nasty and just as violent. It's just the Romans scaling, their overall success was rather unique. And so I took those ideas kind of methodologically and as a theoretical framework, and I thought that was really interesting to ask well kind of considered questions, but from a different perspective. When I went to Louisiana State University for my PhD, I was working with an advisor who his work focused on the Near East. And I'd always had this kind of curiosity about the Near East, about the Middle East, things that I'd been introduced to, of course, but not things that I had specific classes on. And I was always drawn to kind of who the Parthians were and how they interacted in the Greco-Roman world. And so I decided to write my dissertation on interactions between Romans and Parthians, which at the time was a rather novel idea. There hadn't been a whole lot of research, or certainly not monographs or books written on it. Luckily, in the past 10 years, that's become better tread ground, which has been wonderful. There's been a lot more interest in Parthian studies with very important new publications. But once I was in that project, I was going to have my opening chapter be, who are the Parthians? And what I realized is that chapter was very hard to write because there just wasn't a whole lot of recent scholarship on the Parthians. And so obviously I recognized the opportunity there and pivoted, and my dissertation became that first chapter. It was instead a focus on the Romans and the Parthians, and instead, who were the Parthians, right? Where did they come from? How were they successful? And it was really sort of more looking at their militarized culture, how they were able to establish a small kingdom in the Iranian plateau, how they were able to survive and thrive in a very dangerous neighborhood with very militarized and violent neighbors like the Bactrians and the Seleucid Empire. And then also kind of how that eventually led to them creating an empire that rivaled Rome's for multiple centuries. And so through that process, I essentially started publishing on the Parthians specifically. And although there are very, of course, respected and well-published scholars of Parthian studies in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, this is a topic that's not as well focused upon by Western Europeans or Americans. So because I was able to publish some new and hopefully engaging research on the Parthians, I got the attention of Greek and Roman scholars who also kind of were curious about the Parthians, but didn't really have a whole lot of connection to them because there was sort of a lack of research. And that opened up a lot of opportunities for me recently to publish articles, book chapters, so on and so forth. So it kind of made me de facto a Parthian guy, even though, of course, my training it's more kind of classically Romans and Greeks. But I'm happy to be the Parthian guy. I like the Parthians a lot.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, before we go any further, it's very interesting because, yeah, not only are you one of the few Parthian guys out there that I can probably count on one, maybe two hands, probably one hand, let's be honest. But where did your fascination with sort of the militarism aspect come in? Because I feel like it really is interesting and it kind of I don't know if it says something about each scholar, but I'm always very curious. Like for some people, it's like the gorgeous art or the architecture. So for some people, it's like, oh, I read this one text and it was so beautiful, I had to study it. So yeah, for military stuff, where did that come in?
Yeah, so I would have to give credit to Art Eckstein on that. Is that although his work I wouldn't call a military studies in a traditional sense, there he's not looking at X's and O's on the battlefield, for example. Militarism is at the core of what he was researching, and kind of warrior ethos that's common in antiquity, and how you can't really separate ancient societies from warfare. That it went hand in hand, and that the societies that weren't hyper militarized and weren't successful in warfare didn't survive. They just were conquered. That was the end of them. And so that aspect of it, that sort of really human element of kind of security and survival, I always thought was very interesting. I always liked the idea of humanizing the peoples of antiquity, right? That they lived a long time ago, but they were people just like you and I, and they had similar wants and desires, fears, anxieties, so on and so forth. And so, with a group of people like the Parthians, where there's a rather dearth of source material for them, the theoretical approach different from the gong and the same discussions about warrior mentalities and militarized societies and imperialism and those sorts of things. So that's kind of what drove me to that part of it. I like the idea of including the Parthians in the discussion of the great warriors and empires of antiquity, that they deserve a place at the table alongside the Greeks, the Macedonians, and the Romans, and where the scholars who focus on language or culture or material evidence, it's wonderful. They help my research out greatly. I felt that for my focus, from my background, I really wanted to demonstrate that the Parthians deserve to be considered amongst the great warrior peoples of the past, and certainly one of the most successful peoples as far as soldiers and rulers.
Yeah, perfect. That sounds really cool. And you're right. Yeah, we can't really separate militarism from kind of what was going on. One thing that I'm really curious about, though, is now again, whatever I know about the Parthians has been learned in the last like 2 years, so it's quite new. But my impression of them before they became like this big empire, right, is that they really had I guess what I would call maybe humble beginnings, starting kind of as more like a nomadic, steppe based society, right? And one thing that has fascinated me about this is that from these humble sort of nomadic beginnings, can you talk a little bit about how on earth they suddenly got very big, very powerful, and came to have these great relations with these very heavily urbanized societies who were, by this point quite old?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So the origin of the Parthians is something I focus on in my first book, Reign of Arrows, and it's a fascinating story. I fully agree that it's from the most humble of beginnings to the heights of world empire within a relatively small time frame. And it speaks to the success of the Arsacids, the ruling power of the Parthians, that they were able to do so. I mean, this is a family that ruled over a kingdom for, I mean, if you consider just when they are a full empire, 500 years, but even a couple of extra 100 years afterwards in Armenia. So obviously you have a ruling dynasty that's very able over a long period of time, which is pretty rare in a pre-modern sense. But on top of that, because of the kind of the chaos of the Central Asian steppe in the early Hellenistic period, there's a lot of displacement of peoples. And the Parni, who are the tribal kind of identity of who the Parthians are before they arrive in Parthia, the Parni are one of these kind of semi-nomadic groups that are moving kind of further to the south and to the west on the Central Asian steppe. And then they arrive in what would be kind of modern day Turkmenistan, right on the border of the Iranian plateau. And it becomes there's more opportunities for them to expand into the Seleucid Empire, because the Seleucid Empire is also dealing with a lot of turmoil. The Seleucid Empire has always been a little more Western focused on the Eastern Mediterranean with, its rivalry with the Antigonids and the Ptolemies, other successor kingdoms and dynasties from in the wake of Alexander's death. And so the eastern frontier, the vast eastern frontier of the Seleucid Empire, has been largely neglected in recent periods. And when the Parni are really starting to make sort of an identity for themselves, roughly kind of around maybe like 280 to 240, what happens is that the destabilization of the Seleucid Empire creates an opportunity on that frontier zone for the new king of the Parni, Arsaces I, to invade northeastern Iran and essentially establish a kingdom in what used to be a Seleucid satrapy that had rebelled against the central authority of the Seleucid kings. So in that transference of power, what Arsaces I and the Parni do is they very quickly and very effectively integrate into the province of Parthia, establish a kingdom. There seems to be a very rapid assimilation of the Parni into the local aristocracy. And instead of that being a combative relationship, it's actually a really collaborative relationship. And it works really well and really quickly for them. And it allows the Arsacids, the dynasty established by Arsaces I in northeastern Iran, it allows the Arsacids to essentially establish a collaborative form of kingship or imperial rule where local aristocrats are incentivized to buy into the centralized power of the Arsacids in exchange for local favors, autonomy, so on and so forth. And this actually, although it's been seen traditionally by scholars as a debasement of the monarchy of the Hellenistic successor kingdoms or the empire of the Romans, the sort of the medieval F word, feudalism, being thrown around, right, as though that's a pejorative, that's a bad thing. In reality, what the Parthians develop under the Arsacids is a rather flexible and ingenious form of imperialism that helps local communities and local aristocrats buy into the system, the hierarchy of power underneath the ruling dynasty itself. And this allows for the Arsacids to thrive and expand their kingdom over the next handful of generations, to the point that they are the new power of the Middle East. They're the big winners. They have to fight some major wars against the Seleucids to accomplish this, but they beat out the Greco-Bactrians. They beat out the Seleucids, and you could argue that they hold their own very effectively against the Romans.
Well, that's a great answer, one, but two, also that greatly summarizes kind of for listeners who may not have read or be familiar with your first book, what that first book would cover and talk about. And I do know that a few years ago, I want to say, what was it, 2021, 22, something like that, you actually came and gave a talk, I believe, about your book here at UCLA at the Portavood. So I encourage people to go watch the recording of your talk, because if they want to know more, they can get more info there. But I wanted to, one, ask because I was curious, but two, I did want to ask in the context of you are working on kind of a follow-up to this work, and I was hoping that you'd be able to talk to us a little about, yeah, so in a follow-up to this first book, where have your interests turned? What are you looking at now? And yeah, what's something you're hoping to sort of bring to a whole new audience with the work you're doing?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I do have a talk that's recorded through the Portavood library, so please do check that out. It's a part of that project. The first book, Reign of Arrows, is focused on the origin and kind of the success of the Parthians in establishing themselves in the Iranian plateau and how they were able to then also forge an empire. And it ends with the reign of arguably the most successful early Arsacid king, Mithridates II. And it sort of ends with the height of his empire, right? The expansion of the Parthians, the solidification of the eastern frontier, and also the expansion of the western frontier into the lands of the Near East. So one of my sort of follow-up projects to that with Oxford again is tentatively titled King of Kings. And it's a work that looks at just the first half of the first century BCE, and where that is a period in the Near East that obviously has a lot going on geopolitically, culturally, diplomatically, that this is a period that mostly has been the focus of scholars interested in Rome. So you would say Rome-centric in its sort of approach and narrative. That obviously the sources are Greek and Roman, so it's easier and more natural, I guess, to understand what's going on here from a Roman perspective. But I think that it's valuable to also try to consider, well, what are Eastern actors doing in this period and how are they seeing things perhaps differently? So it's not just a focus on the Parthians like my first book really was. This book will consider the Romans to an extent, but mostly as outsiders from a more Eastern perspective. And what it really wants to do is try to understand what's going on with like Mithridatic Pontus, with Tigranes II of Armenia, and the various Arsacid kings, and how are Eastern actors viewing the rapidly changing geopolitical situation in the Near East in that first half of the first century, and how the traditionally Rome-centric understanding of these developments perhaps doesn't really reflect very effectively what Pontus or Armenia or Parthia is doing or seeing or how they're reacting to these things. And that's sort of what I'm hoping is to try to change the conversation just slightly to create a more expansive and inclusive space for other Eastern actors alongside the Romans, which obviously are hugely successful in that period. The other project that I'm working on is focused specifically on the Parthians, but it's focused on the militarism of Parthia. So kind of going to your earlier question, why I sort of had a focus on that is right now I'm in the weeds of looking at militarism in the Parthian world, and so that's a work that will have aspects of looking at Parthian warfare as the approaches to that warfare tactically and strategically. So there'll be a bit of X's and O's for those who are interested in military studies more generally. So it's meant to hopefully elicit interest in a general audience who want to understand who the Parthians are as warriors and why they're so effective as warriors. But it also is going to consider aspects of thematically kind of how the Parthians are viewed by the Greeks and the Romans, right? What kind of warriors do the Romans and Greeks see them as? And then where possible, reading in between the lines, trying to consider the Parthians on their own terms. How is it that the Parthians want to be viewed by the Greeks and the Romans, right? What are they doing in their society? This is a cavalry-based society that focuses on and revolves around the importance of horses. The aristocracy is very much driven towards the importance of being good riders and having large stables of horses that you can call upon. And then, of course, in warfare, the Parthians are cavalry based, which makes them very distinct from their Greek, Macedonian, and Roman rivals. They fight very differently. And so it stands to that point that if they fight so differently, they probably approach warfare a little bit differently as well. So that's kind of what I'm trying to accomplish in that book, and just sort of a holistic understanding of the Parthians at war and how that kind of filters into their actual X's and O's of combat, but also into their reputation, their society, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like fascinating work. And also, you've opened about 10,000 different doors that I could possibly go through in terms of questions. I will try to rein it down so the audience does not get too lost, and also for my own sanity, so I don't trip over my various threads that are going and going. You can hopefully practically see the wheels turning in my brain right now. But I will not be afraid to admit to you, I was like a really big horse girl growing up. So anything that's like cavalry based, bringing in the horses, I gravitated to, like I love. So one of the things from when I was long ago in undergrad learning about basic warfare stuff is I remember learning, Greek horses usually came from a specific part of northern Greece, and you wanted like the specific, you wanted a horse either from Thrace or Macedonia, wherever. But the characterization of them are that they're smaller, like the modern horses we think of and the ones we see presented in Hollywood, right? Like every description ever of like Bucephalus, you just see this like huge sort of Clydesdale sized thing, or it's an Arabian or Frisian, and it's like it's gorgeous. That's not what they really had. So from the Parthian side, what kind of horses did they have? Did they have the same kind of horses, that we think of for the Greeks, like because they're, geographically more east, are you getting some of those kind of, I don't know, like the shaggy Mongolian ponies? Like, yeah, what kind of horses are they using? And it's especially interesting because as they're cavalry based, like this is no small thing, right? You got to have a good kind of powerful horse that helps you kind of propel yourself along, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in that book on Parthian warfare, I do talk about kind of the logistical capabilities of the Parthians and their state. One thing that they're very good at and get better at is the breeding of horses, which is obviously something that's important to their society and their warfare. So Originally, the types of horses that they're using would be very commonplace on the Central Asian steppe, perhaps not quite what we would consider how the Mongolian horses are, but more they're renowned for their durability, their grace, and their speed. And the idea is that their durability in particular is something that Roman and Greek authors take note of. That these horses are not only kind of fast and maneuverable, they can go without water when Roman and Greek horses wouldn't be able to, meaning they could cross, difficult terrain like the Roman and Greek horses can't do. And so these Central Asian horses that they're using are very sort of stout and dependable horses. And these horses generally are going to, throughout the Hellenistic period, going to be favored by horse archers. So generally with the composition of a Parthian army, you roughly, and these are rough kind of estimates, you roughly are going to have about 15 to 20% of that force of cavalry being your heavy cavalry, meant to be shock cavalry in the form of what are known as cataphracts, right? The idea that they're encased in armor, that sort of thing, right? But the rest of the force is going to be light armed horse archers. They're not going to have really any armor on them, and they're there to harass the enemy very rapidly and deliver fire, right? And so those soldiers need a particular mount to be effective. And so those Central Asian horses are very effective at doing so. Now, when the Parthians become successful in the Iranian plateau, they start becoming introduced to and gain more access to Iranian horses. And these Iranian horses are, and again, in the sources, bred by the Achaemenid Persians before and the Seleucids in the Hellenistic period. These horses are world renowned, again, for their beauty, their speed, their size, right? That's something that's always emphasized, how big these horses are. And that's because of the very available pastureland of places like Armenia and Media in the sort of central Middle Eastern world. And so the Parthians, being in northeastern Iran, are right on the doorstep of this new access to these larger Iranian horses. And essentially, once they start gaining more access to these horses, start breeding these horses, those are the horses that are favored by the heavy cavalry. So you have this nice blend that eventually emerges where the horses are really kind of tailored to different styles of combat, and where the cataphracts prefer the Iranian horses that are very powerful and strong and beautiful, right? Which is, of course, going to align well with their aristocratic backgrounds. The everyday Parthian horse archer is very happy for the traditional sort of stouter, more durable mounts that are traditionally associated with kind of the nomadic warfare of the Central Asian steppe in this period.
That's so fascinating. I do love anything about using horses for warfare. So this is like right up my alley stuff.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that both the Romans and the Chinese were very eager to trade with the Parthians to get their hands on both of those types of horses, that both sides recognized that these were really well-bred horses. Because again, you have to remember that a horse is an animal. It's not a tool, right? So in order for an animal to be effective in battle, it also has to be bred very well and trained very well. And so it's to the credit of the Parthians that their horses are a commodity to their neighbors, because the neighbors know that these are not only really effective animals, very skilled in various ways, but the Parthians are really good at breeding them and really good at training. So yeah, it's one of those things where the Parthians help themselves out, exponentially, because they're a cavalry-based society, cavalry-based military that also excelled at breeding the cavalry that they need for those things.
Well, it's interesting because doesn't a lot of like these renowned skills, or the idea that you should be highly skilled at something like training horses, I mean, it's such a powerful idea that, I mean, it finds its way, I feel like, into, even common mythology. What I think what one of Hector's like attributes, right, is he's a tamer of horses, and because they place emphasis on like this is so important, and you're going through the myth, and when you're kind of studying it, you're like, oh, okay, so they value this, and then when you kind of are analyzing, what's going on with the Trojan War, you're like, ah, okay, so clearly one side's got the good cavalry, and the dude who's like great with the horse whisperer, right? And then the others not so much. So they kind of have your standard like just army on the ground. So it's interesting how even these skills, you recognize them, yes, in terms of everyday life, but also it filters its way into things like the mythology, which I think is quite interesting. One thing that I'm also curious about is when thinking about Parthian, equipment for war, even down to things like decorative, but also useful equipment like saddles. I'm not familiar enough, so can you tell us, is there something, right, militaristic that the Parthians had that clearly, if you see it, it's defined as Parthian? Because I'm just thinking kind of, okay, what do I remember? Like, if you say, oh, here's a sarissa, right, the super long spear, and then you go, oh yes, but that's like a clearly Macedonian thing, Philip too, blah blah blah. So I can point to a couple of those things for Greece, Rome, other places, but for Parthia, I don't think I could do it.
Yeah, so the most iconic weapon of the Parthians is the bow. They developed a composite bow that is really effective. It's a technological advantage that they have, where it's a relatively small bow compared to other bows being used by contemporary powers or contemporary, states and armies. But it does not lose any of its range or impact despite its relatively small scale. And so this is something obviously they develop from other kind of bow technologies that are developing on the Central Asian steppe. But because they establish an empire in the Middle East where they have the infrastructure to kind of create more technologies and to also sort of start developing these things in more of a bulk sort of a production, if you will, they develop a very effective composite bow that allows the Parthians to engage enemies with their proverbial Parthian shot, right? That's the thing that I suppose most people, if they've heard about the Parthians or know about Parthian warfare, they've probably heard the Parthian shot. The Parthian shot is I would call a technique of delivering fire, where Parthian riders are effective in delivering fire not only while they're advancing on their mounts, but also while they're withdrawing. And so the Parthian shot is really this ability to deliver fire with your bow from all sides of your mount, forward and back, and from the left and from the right, where you can deliver precise and effective fire at all times in a continual barrage. And that this Parthian shot, although not innovated by the Parthians, is made famous by the Parthians because they're the ones that introduce it so effectively to the Greeks and the Romans. And so the Greeks and the Romans associate this style of military maneuvering with the Parthians. So certainly the bow is the weapon that would be most associated with the Parthians. It's also the weapon that's always used by the Arsacid kings on the coinage. So when you have an Arsacid coin or a Parthian coin, you have one side that has the king, right? Because you want to emphasize who's king to your people. But on the other side, what it has is it has sort of a seated or sort of a kneeling archer. And the idea is that again shows whether it's sort of idealized or not, it shows you this idea of the importance of archery to who they are, and it emphasizes their most deadly and impactful weapon, which is this composite bow. So they don't. You're right that they don't have like the Gladius Hispanianus or the Sarissa that sort of jumps off the pages. But what the Parthians are is really effective sportsmen who can deliver a deadly amount of fire from a good distance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting. And I have friends who love archery, so I'm sure that if I kind of ask them, hey, so do you know some of the history and some of the ancient peoples who are really good at archery? They'd probably say absolutely not. So if anything, people who like archery can know we can thank the Parthians then for a composite bow because yeah, I just as a casual observer and person who likes learning about these kind of developments, yeah, I think I would.
Yeah, you brought up earlier the Mongolians, right?
Yeah.
I think that perhaps people are more familiar with the Mongolians or the Turks and how effective those peoples were with horse and bow. The Parthians are the ancient equivalent of that. That they, like the Turks and like the Mongolians in a medieval context, the Parthians are the first nomadic people to establish a land empire that thrives for centuries, and it does so without compromising their nomadic background, right? As far as kind of their horse-based culture and their horse-based military, that they don't reform their army to Iranian or Greek or Roman standards because they're so good at what they do, which is riding horses and shooting bows, and that's really effective for them on the battlefield. They score victory after victory after victory against the Seleucids and the Romans using this approach to warfare.
I mean, if they're really successful, and obviously, yeah, you brought up if you look a bit further in time to the medieval period, yeah, I mean, eventually you're going to get what Attila and and the rest of that sort of nomadic empire as well. But like Attila stands out, right? Like I feel like you ask a casual observer, you just say the name, Attila the Hun, and people go, "Oh yeah, yeah, I kind of know about that guy." Why is there not like someone who jumps out immediately from the Parthians if they were like the precursors to Attila?
Yeah, you're right. There's no Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun for the Parthians. I think that part of that is that those historical actors were particularly seen as boogeymen to the people that they were terrorizing, including the Chinese and the Romans. And so, because of that, there's a strong literature that focuses on the terror of Genghis Khan and the Mongolians, the terror of Attila and the Huns, that you don't necessarily have with the Parthians. The Parthian success story is much more of a slow burn. It's not a very rapid rise and fall. Attila he does great things, but he's kind of like Alexander, right? He dies and everything just falls apart, right? Because no one's there to follow that cult of personality. The Arsacids, they're one of the reasons why the Parthians are so successful, at least this is what I argue, is that the Arsacid dynasty is stable and very successful, that you have a long string of capable administrators and warrior kings who are able to lead the people and lead the army effectively. And that starts changing once you get into the first century BCE. That's something I focus on in my new book project about that period. That in essence, the Parthians by that point, kind of like the Romans, become kind of a victim of their own success. And there's just so much power at stake that you start having dynastic conflict, people fighting over who gets to be the king of kings, right? The main guy. And unfortunately, that kind of destabilizes the dynasty and affects kind of how they're able to be effective as warriors and imperialists, at least for a time. But I would say again that mirrors very much the Roman war. The Romans are going through the exact same problem, right, with the rise of these warlords like Crassus and Pompey, Caesar, Marius, Sulla, that sort of thing. Essentially, that's kind of a reflection of really successful ancient empires, is that you eventually get to a point where there's so much at stake, so much power available, that you start having fighting inside of the state. But for the Arsacids, why there isn't that one guy? Because it is kind of this slow burn. It's this slow story of growth and success. Like I said, the main guys that would sort of jump off the page, for those have more of a kind of an understanding of the period, Arsaces the first, the founder, and Mithridates the second, who sort of establishes the empire. And then those who are familiar with Roman studies or Roman militarism, Orodes the second, who's the Parthian king when Crassus goes out and gets himself killed at Carrhae. So there are kind of these glimpses of these important leaders in the Parthian world, but you're right that there's not these kind of like sort of men that transcend time and have kind of this reputation. And I think that's partially because of the slow nature of how successful the Parthians and the Arsacids are over time, and also partially because we don't have that Greek or Roman source that has survived, unfortunately, that was focused on Parthia. All we have are little snapshots, little glimpses into the Parthian world. Most sources, the vast majority, they're focused on all sorts of other things, and they just kind of mention the Parthians in passing. So if we had some of the lost works of the Greeks and the Romans that were Parthian histories, you might have more of a sense of, no, this king was particularly great or particularly fierce, so on and so forth.
Too bad. Now we have Alexander, who obviously we know from history. He made his way all the way to like the Indus River Valley, basically, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, he's discovering all these people, these things, going on these journeys through like Greco-Bactria and all of this. So what we have, right, is this super Greek and Roman centralized version of events, and we kind of study that. Now, what I like about your work, as you mentioned, for a couple of projects you're working on, is bringing in some other perspectives, decentralizing Greece and Rome, and kind of looking at the Parthians from maybe other sides, right? And one thing I'm really curious about is from Alexander's tales, right? You get stories of, oh, and he encountered these odd people, and oh, look at these odd animals. He found elephants, and wow. So because Parthia, geographically, right, it's kind of stretching all in sort of the Iranian plateau reaching over into Asia. We do obviously have contacts between China and Parthia and kind of things going back and forth. So we have established that pretty much the Parthians are a very sort of cavalry-based, horse-based society. But I'm kind of curious, do we have accounts? Do we know of like, did they experiment with other sort of more exotic, quote unquote, animals in terms of not just warfare, but like even just everyday life? Because geographically, I'm like, there's more than just horses over there. I mean, if Alexander got far enough to see elephants, I'm not saying they like rode elephants into battle or, other fantastical animals that they have kind of to the east, but I mean, I've got to imagine, right?
Yeah, so of course, they're aware of these sort of more exotic creatures. Certainly, again, this what I've at least my opinion on this, what I've kind of just sort of come up with myself is the Parthians, unlike the Achaemenid Persians, unlike the Hellenistic successors, unlike the Sasanian Persians who come after the Arsacids, they don't embrace elephants as a form of any kind of military usefulness. Now, I think that, again, there's this sense that elephants are kind of like the ancient tanks of the battlefield, right? They just kind of go in and bulldoze over things. But I always push back on that with my students, especially because at the end, remember, an elephant is an animal. It's not a machine, right? And certainly by the Hellenistic period, everyone that is well versed in warfare is very aware of where elephants excel and where they are huge liabilities on the battlefield. And so, even within Hellenistic warfare, where the Seleucids are very proud of their stable of Indian war elephants that they've gotten from the Marian empire that's emerged in the Indus River Valley, mostly where those elephants are used is not really in a tank capacity trying to roll over the enemy anymore, because that's not effective. Elephants don't like weird sounds. They don't like weird smells. They don't like stepping on sharp things. And so you can essentially stop the attack of elephants pretty effectively using some very basic defensive tools, like, again, things that they're not comfortable with, things that are sharp, so on and so forth. And so, what the Seleucid Empire is mostly using elephants using them for, by kind of the wars against the Ptolemies, is not really trying to use them as an offensive weapon anymore. They're actually used as a deterrent to enemy cavalry. It just so happens that horses don't like the smell of elephants. And so it's hard to get your horses to charge elephants because they don't want to be around elephants. Who could blame them, right? And the idea there is that you can use your elephants as a screen to essentially protect your flank against enemy horse maneuvers. And that's more what the Seleucids are actually using them for. They're like these big beasts who have sort of an intimidation factor. They obviously have an element of kind of beauty to them and regalness to them, which was very useful to the Seleucids. But their actual combat effectiveness is very minimal. And on top of that, logistically, it costs a lot, and it's a lot of food and water that you have to organize in order to have a stable of elephants moving with you on campaign or in a battle. And so what the Arsacid Parthians figure out is that their horses and elephants that doesn't work, right? It's hard to coordinate that on the battlefield. And then on top of that, logistically, it's not to the Parthians' benefit. The great strength of the Parthians on campaign is that they can move rapidly, right? They can outpace Greek and Roman armies that are heavy infantry based because they have cavalry, right? And they have really good horses that can move over desert and difficult terrain. And so that mobility is one of the reasons why the Parthians are so militarily successful. And the last thing that they want to do is compromise that with infantry or elephants, et cetera, et cetera. So it really is kind of a natural reaction to what's the value versus the potential costs. And so even though you could argue that the Parthians have technically access to Indian war elephants, they're just not useful in any real capacity, even for the nobility, right? Your nobility comes through how beautiful your horse is. It's not necessarily how big and awesome your elephant is. And so there's these kind of cultural and military reasons for why elephant warfare is not a component of the Arsacid period, where it is a component of the more heavy infantry-based armies of the Persians, the Greeks, the Macedonians, the Romans, so on and so forth. So I hope that kind of gets to that. But it's more than just why aren't they using them to sort of smash enemy formations if they have access to it. It's actually a component of how animals interact. It's a component of how their societies are different, and it's really a logistical consideration. They don't want to slow their horses down on campaign, and they don't want to have to find all the food and water in order to make sure the elephants don't die. So those are the sorts of things they're thinking about.
Yeah, no, I think it's really helpful, and I wanted to bring in that perspective to people who often don't think about it because I think when it looks good in a Hollywood film, right? You're like, "Oh, this like why didn't they use this all the time? Like look at how good this elephant is like smashing up. They won the battle in 5 minutes." And then you're like not thinking about but what actually goes into it and why is this not practical if you had it one place but not another. So no, it's really helpful to have someone who's thinking about like what does this actually mean, not just what looks nice in Hollywood. And speaking of kind of how we view things, one thing that I wanted to make sure that you got some time to address and talk about is yeah, these are different from kind of what the Greeks and the Romans are doing. And they are coming out of the East, and to the Greeks and the Romans, that was scary because you're like, oh, things are coming out of the East. What are we going to encounter today? And so you said that, one of your projects you're kind of working on is looking at how the Parthians are viewed by these people who are pretty much seeing them and going, oh my gosh, what is this? So I was hoping that you could just hit on, yeah, like let's talk about how they were viewed because they're doing a lot of really interesting things that we understand today, but like no one necessarily would have really understood that. They just see it and they're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it's again, it's one of those things of perspective, right? The, the Greeks and the Romans, and we have some Jewish voices from the Near East. They have mostly an outside foreign perspective of the Parthians. And so with that, that creates difficulties for those studying Parthia because you are viewing Parthia and the Parthians through a lens, right? A foreign lens, which is always going to create elements of stereotype and bias and misunderstanding that you then have to try to filter through logic and reason to say, well, that's not actually what's going on with what the Parthians are doing or what they mean to be doing or the perspective that they have, so on and so forth. That's the delicate dance that I do in my research, really. And I hope that it's been effective, and I have had good feedback with that from many scholars. But I certainly understand the scholars who push back and go, well, how can we really know this if we only have the Greeks and the Romans? Which again is to be fair. They as far as Parthian studies is concerned, there are internal sources, if you want to call them that. So you have inscriptions, Babylonian, cuneiform records, numismatics, so the study of coinage, very important, obviously, to the reconstruction of Parthian studies. But in general, right, how the Romans and the Greeks view the Parthians is as rivals, as outsiders, and it creates this very unique perspective on the Parthians from that viewpoint because the Greeks and the Romans almost have to do like these mental gymnastics to explain the Parthians, where they are clearly barbaroi, they're clearly barbarians, right? They're foreigners who speak a foreign language. And so there's no getting around that. But unlike other barbarians, the Parthians are successful barbarians. And so they have this kind of begrudging, reluctant sort of this need to sort of explain why that is, right? Where if if the Parthians are barbarians, why can't we beat them in war? Why can't we conquer them? And so they have to kind of figure out how we're going to dance around this to make sense of it for us and our audience. And there's certainly different scholars would have different perspectives on this. My takeaway from this is that in war specifically, they view the Parthians as kind of these courageous cowards, where they are no doubt effective warriors who are terrifying and have really, effective weapons, and they can beat us. But deep down, what they are is they are cowardly barbarians because they won't stand and fight against us. They like to run around us with their horses. They like to shoot at us from afar. They retreat, but then attack, right? So they're being disingenuous and running away and then coming back. And so, yeah, that's kind of my phrase for how the Greeks and the Romans view the Parthians are these like courageous cowards, that they are these very successful warriors that ultimately won't be manly enough to fight us Greeks and Romans mano a mano, because then they would obviously lose, right? So there is kind of this very strange relationship intellectually that builds between the Greeks and the Romans in particular, because the Greek sources that we have are mostly lost. We have Polybius as kind of our earliest true Greek source that talks about the Parthians in any detail. But most of what we have about the Parthians is from like the late Republican period and the imperial period. So it's mostly the Romans that are dominating this. And the Romans, again, living in the late Republic and the Empire, have to deal with the reality that Crassus got killed, Antony got his butt kicked. They've had a lot of problems with the Parthians. And so not only is that an exercise by the Romans where they have to explain away why Crassus lost or why Antony lost, they also have to kind of explain, well, if these are barbarian peoples, why are we struggling with them? And it's because no matter what kind of credits we give them, oh, they're brave, they're fierce warriors, their weapons are super effective, they have great cavalry, they're good at imperialism, right? That sort of stuff. At the end of the day, they are still barbarians, and so therefore they are inferior to us, and that's kind of this weird relationship that they're building with the Parthians in their own mind, in essence.
It's interesting because my mind was automatically going to try to make a sort of more modern cultural reference to make it easier for myself to sort of understand this perception. Now, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to make a very Game of Thronesy reference, but also maybe just a very modern reference in general, which is it's like it sounds kind of like the old thing of you have like the better trained warriors, but they're outnumbered with the kind of like maybe inferior force, but they're just larger. So when I think of it, I thought immediately of like when Jon Snow, right, it goes to confront Ramsay Bolton and he's like, well, we're outnumbered. We're probably going to lose, but I'm going to try. So he like challenges him, right? And he's like, well, why don't you fight me single combat? And then we'll see who wins. Why involve our men? Like, that's ridiculous. And then Ramsay just kind of sits down and goes, well, I know my army would crush yours. So like, no, I don't want to fight you. Like, why potentially lose when our numbers will win? And so it's like that came to my mind when you were saying like, yeah, like the kind of brave cowards, but also so that reference popped in because I was like, oh, so I wonder if it's like, yeah, the Greeks and Romans are like, well, we're clearly the Jon Snows here, just come and fight us. And it seems like the Parthians, they perceive them right as the Ramsay Boltons of the no, we'll just dance around you from afar and like shoot our arrows and whittle you down.
Yeah, no, there's definitely something to that. Now, the only part of that analogy that for me doesn't work is that the Parthians are largely outnumbered in every engagement. That they have far fewer soldiers than the Greeks, Macedonians, or Romans that they're fighting because they have cavalry, right? You can't have as many cavalry as infantry. But that being said, they do outnumber their enemies usually with cavalry, so they do have that advantage. So what they always have on their side is they have the advantage of maneuverability and mobility, right? So that is their advantage on the battlefield. And we do have plenty of examples of Greek and Roman armies that are hoping that, yes, the Parthians will stop shooting at them and actually come fight them. And if you're not able to force them into combat, they're not going to necessarily want to do that because it's not to their advantage. And again, if you're shooting at a stationary target, you're going to be pretty effective, right? If the enemy can't move around and you have aerial superiority, you're not going to win a lot of those battles or a lot of those wars. That's true in modern warfare as it is in ancient warfare. But with the Parthians, what the Greek and Roman sources do emphasize is that when they somehow do force the Parthians into combat, the Parthians are not so good at that part. So, like, Cassius Dio has this like summary of who the Parthians are, and he basically goes like, yeah, they're fierce fighters in the right circumstances. They can they built a nice empire, but they can't siege anything to save their lives. And if you ever get in close quarters with them, they can't fight at all. Right. So there's like this kind of idea by the Romans and the Greeks that if they would just fight us like traditional, civilized infantry warriors do, then we would have no problem with that. It's that they fight in this barbaric style with their horses and their bows, and therefore that's why we're having trouble with them.
Yeah. classic give up your advantage and you'll be crushed. So no wonder they don't want to do that. Man, I could really get in and talk more war strategy because this is fun. But
Yeah, please.
I fear that we would be talking about it all night. So and sadly I don't think that either you or I really want to be staying up all night and talking about this. Or maybe you would. I would enjoy it, but that would not be strictly healthy for either of us. So there's so much we didn't get into that I feel so sad about. But instead, since we don't really have time for that, I'm going to instead ask you to please direct all of our listeners to any, published works that you have out there that you would like people to read if they're interested in learning more. Obviously, we've sort of previewed the stuff you're working on. And also, could you tell us where can people follow you? Are you on social media? Do you have an academia page? All this stuff.
Well, I guess the saying is always leave the audience wanting more, right? So maybe if there's demand for it, I can join you for part two of Parthians. But yes, so I have an academia page. It's just if you Google my first name and last name, so Nikolaus Overtoom, Nikolaus Overtoom, and academia.edu. It'll pop up. I'm very good about posting what I'm working on and the things that I've published on there. So that's an easy way to gain access to like previous articles I've written, stuff like that. I have some new book chapters coming out in various Brill and Oxford companions, where I'm very thankful for the opportunity to include the Parthians in what are otherwise focused studies on the Greeks and the Romans. And then, yes, my book project. So, Reign of Arrows has already come out with Oxford University Press in 2020. It went into paperback in 2022. So, if you want to get the nice hardback, by all means, go for it. But there is a much more cost-effective paperback that's also available to you. That's available at Oxford University Press's website or on Amazon, that sort of thing. And then, yeah, in the future on the horizon, please do look for my book on Parthian warfare, tentatively called The Parthians at War, and then my other Oxford project, which will probably be out in the next couple of years, which again is tentatively called King of Kings. So yeah, those are the things that I'm working on. And like I said, on academia, you can also message various scholars. So by all means, if you heard me talk on this podcast and you want to shoot me a question, you can always do so there.
Great. Well, the last thing I do for each podcast episode is I have two final questions that I'd like to ask our guests.
Interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
And the first of these questions is, what, in your opinion, is the greatest legacy left to us from the Persians?
From the Persians. Interesting. Well, the greatest legacy of the Persians is that, in my opinion, we're talking, I suppose, the Achaemenid Persians, the original Persian Empire, would be that.
No, I mean, you can choose any point in Persian history. Sorry, I should just say like a very general, like you can make it this very broad.
Yeah, sure. So the reason why I paused there is that I wouldn't classify the Parthians as Persians. So I find that they're something different, something unique. They have Iranian and Hellenistic or Hellenic elements that are also mixed into their own kind of unique nomadic background. But if we're looking at like the traditional Persian empire of the Achaemenids, at least in my classes, what I always emphasize is their great legacy is that they're the first true classical empire. That again, kind of like what happens with the Parthians, what we know of the Achaemenids largely comes from the Greeks, and the Greeks are the neighbors slash rivals slash enemies of the Persians, and so they don't give the Persians a fair shake. Again, the Persians are portrayed as the barbaroi, right? The barbarians. And in reality, it's a civilization that accomplishes such amazing and important things geopolitically and then also culturally, economically, technology-wise, sciences, math, so on and so forth. These are things that I think are similar thematically in later periods like the Arsacid period or the Sasanian period, that since the source material largely comes from foreign and sometimes hostile observers, whether it be the Greeks, the Romans, or the Muslims in the form of the Sasanian Persian experience, that it's easy to kind of underappreciate how significant these Middle Eastern empires are to the wider developments of world history and, and under the kind of the umbrella of whatever the squishy term of Western history is, that you don't really have a Greek and Roman experience like we know without also understanding who they're interacting with and who they're engaging for centuries in the forms of these other imperial collaborators sometimes, and then also sometimes rivals in the form of the Persians and the Parthians.
Yeah, excellent. Well, and the second and final question I really have for you is, what in your opinion would be the best legacy that we ourselves as scholars, right, can leave for future students of Iranian studies?
Yeah. What I think the next generation of scholars of the ancient Iranian world, if we're going to use that as kind of the catch-all large term, is what you can be doing is trying as much as possible to view things that are traditionally from that Greco-Roman perspective in any sort of possible different light. And sometimes that might not work, but the exercise in and of itself, I think, is really important and really, really healthy. That especially with the study of ancient Iran being relatively small and certainly overshadowed by Greek and Roman studies, that any sort of effort to give these ancient peoples and empires their due, and kind of like what I said earlier in our discussion, right? Give them a seat at the table. Right? They deserve to be there and be included in the discussion. That's, I think, what the past generations of scholars have tried to do, what the current generation of scholars like myself are trying to do. And I think that there's a lot of growth and opportunity there for future students and scholars as well.
Yeah, that's so awesome. Well, for sure, I hope that there's definitely enough material for a part 2 or something. So I hope that we can make something work in the future because, man, I'd love to just ask you all these great military questions all night. So yeah, I hope you'll come back at some future date. Maybe when you've released a new book.
I would be happy to, and yeah, there's always more stuff to unpack, and I don't mind talking about militarism. So by all means, if that's what you're interested in, then I can certainly oblige you.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much again for joining me on the podcast. It's been so fun.
All right. Yeah, thank you.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Portavood Institute and at Portavood UCLA, or visit our website portavood.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Portavood Institute, please email us at portavoodpodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.